Okay. Sorry for those who are still outside, hoping that they, at the end, will decide to join us. Okay, I'm pleased and thankful that we all arrived to the last session of these very beautiful 2 days. We are very happy, and I thank again to all the colleagues that helped us. Because we are very happy of this insightful and enriching 2 days of discussion and of presentation. This final panel is actually part 2 of what Andreas shared during the last 2 hours. So a set of empirical and / methodological reflection and exercises aiming again to study the relationship between tech change, broadly speaking, characteristics of work, employment, wages, and the role of artificial intelligence in driving the dynamics that we for long discussed during these 2 days. So I immediately hand the mic to Martina Bisello, a research officer at Eurofound, and as Enrique Fernandez Macias anticipated this morning, she will show us some reflection and the framework for measuring tasks across occupations, focusing on concepts and showing some applications. Please, Martina.
Thank you, Dario, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for surviving until this last session. The title of the presentation is a framework for measuring tasks across occupations. So my aim today is to provide you an overview of what we have done at Eurofound in the last couple of years, together with Enrique, who now moved at the JRC, in terms of analysis of the task content of jobs. So I will briefly present you what probably we should call more of a taxonomy, as it was mentioned in 2 previous presentation in the first session this afternoon, rather than a framework itself, and even more to align expectations and not to disappoint you. You're not going to see any fancy econometric models or complex hypothesis testing, so it's going to be a light presentation, really just to make you familiarize with what we're doing at Eurofound. And I'm not sure how many of you knows what Eurofound is. It's a short name for European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions, and we are a European Union decentralized agency, one of the many, around 40 scattered around Europe, founded in the 70s. The height of tripartitism. So we have a tripartite setting with a governing board with representatives from trade unions, employers associations, European Commission, and member states. So you can imagine that the development of our research projects has to go through a lot of steps. And currently our chairwoman actually of our governing board is Aviana Bulgarelli, that you are all familiar with. So just a brief introduction, because sometimes I find myself speaking at conferences and people don't know exactly who we are, and we are based in Dublin. And thank you so much for the invitation today. I know that we are working together with INAPP also on other topics of platform economy, so we're really happy to be here today. And last but not least, we're also a data provider as an organization. We heard yesterday in some presentations that people are using the European Working Conditions Survey data, which we collect, but we also collect the European Company Survey and the European Quality of Life Survey. Now, as I was mentioning, today I would like to briefly present you a set of task indices that we developed in Eurofound in the context of the European Jobs Monitor project. This is an ongoing project since 2008, which basically looks at structural changes in the labor market, and each year has a thematic section, and in 2016 we look specifically at the task content of European jobs. And now, after that, I will illustrate some empirical applications of this framework for labor market analysis, both static and dynamic. A very simple application just describing task profiles of jobs in the economy, which we think is very useful because we can provide a very, very detailed profile in a broad spectrum. And then other applications look at changes over time. This is something that Enrique was hinting at earlier this morning, how tasks evolved and changed both between and within occupations. And then the last two applications are within a big project that is the future of manufacturing in Europe. The Eurofund is carrying out in the last 4 years. This is a project proposed by the European Parliament and delegated to Eurofund by the DG Growth in the European Commission. And we're doing two things. One, it's basically matching our task framework with the employment forecast that are developed by CEDEFOP, which is another EU agency based in Greece, and they do the skill forecasting exercise. So we basically match the two in order to gain some insights on possible future task structure. And the second one, which is the last of my presentation, it's instead a completely different approach. It's qualitative. So what we did, again, within this future manufacturing project, was to do some interviews at the company level to workers using our framework, task framework as a compass, to gain some insight about qualitative changes in the task content of some specific manufacturing jobs. And I'll tell you more about it later. Now, in terms of our framework, what we tried to do was to measure all the relevant aspects of work, having in mind that from a review of the literature and also from what we heard earlier in other presentation today, many studies tend to classify tasks in quite broad categories, whether it's the abstract versus manual, routine versus non-routine, so this kind of dichotomy. And most of the time, the social aspect is neglected, and even when some kind of service category is included, this is usually quite broad. So what we tried to do was to really to try to capture in a more systematic and encompassing way all the different aspects of work. And in order to do so, we do it having in mind two separate axes. On the one hand, what people do at work, which is the content of work activity intended as a transformative process of either things, ideas, or social relations. And on the other hand, the way people work, which is the work organization, but also the tools that are used in order to perform certain tasks. And we do think that keeping these two elements separate is important. Enrique was hinting at that this morning, and the reason being that there is not just a direct effect of technology on the content of jobs, but this is also mediated by the work organization. Our framework has a hierarchical structure. In the sense that each index can be then broken down at a higher level of detail in order to investigate more significant findings. And this is also important to allow us to study how different tasks interact at a more detailed level rather than taking these broad categories of manual versus non-manual and routine versus non-routine. And this is how it looked like. In terms of task content, we identify essentially three categories, which are physical, intellectual, and social tasks. We think it's important to differentiate within the physical task category, which essentially includes every task that aim at explicitly at the physical manipulation and transformation of material things. We think it's important to differentiate two separate subcategories. To some extent, on the one hand, tasks that measure pure exertion of power, so strength, and other instead that capture dexterity. The reason why this is important to keep separate, we think, is because the effect of technological change on the aggregate, on physical tasks is that of a replacement, but there are important differences within these broad categories. For instance, we know that historically physical tasks that require exertion of strength are those that are more likely to be replaced, and this is also a positive development from the human perspective, but those that require instead dexterity and especially hand-eye coordination are much more difficult to automate. The same for intellectual tasks. Broadly speaking, we know that these are much more difficult to be replaced by technology, but yet there are important differences within these broad categories that we think are important to emphasize. And we know that information processing tasks, they require processing of encoded and structured information, whether they are numerical or verbal. They are of course much more likely to be replaced by computer, and this has happened, and we see it happening. And this is not the case instead for problem-solving tasks, especially those that require creativity. Social tasks are in general more protected from replacement of computers, but here again we think it's important to have a very detailed breakdown of social tasks, and in particular we identify 4 different categories, one more related to the aspect of serving and attending a customer, the other to teaching, training or coaching. The third one in terms of selling or influencing or persuading, and the fourth one instead it has to do with managing or coordinating people. In terms of the way work is organized, we identify essentially 3 groups of 3 different set of indices. One, it captures the extent of autonomy, so self-direction and decision latitude. The second one, teamwork. And this is something that actually earlier this morning was mentioned, the difference in the work organization at the firm level, how people coordinate among each other and instead in a platform economy. So we think it's important to have a measure that captures this dimension. And then the extent of routine work, which for us is not a matter of content of work, but it's how work is organized. And it can be either in terms of repetitiveness, so how many repetitive or monotonous tasks you perform at work, or in terms of standardization, so whether your work implies meeting certain production or performance targets. And then simply tools, of course, can be divided in ICT and non-ICT. Now, our framework is very rich, so there is not currently one single source that is available at the European level in order to create all these indices. So what we did, we use a combination of 3 different sources, the European Working Conditions Survey data, PIAC and ONET. This is of course far from being perfect, and we would have liked to have one single source, and this is probably going to be possible in the future because the LFS ad hoc module on jobs skills of 2022, it is based on our task framework, so hopefully we will have enough data to conduct a better analysis. So this is really just a preview and the best we can do with the current data. But essentially, okay, it's probably very small, but we tried to map each index to the available sources. Most of the time, each index it's a combination of different sources, either at the workers level or at the occupational level, such as ONET. Of course, some sources are stronger in certain areas rather than others. European Working Conditions Survey is very good in the work organization part. PIAC is very good in the intellectual, especially literacy and numeracy part. And ONET is actually is good because it has this modular approach, so it covers quite different areas. Now, I had a few slides actually on the methodology for the construction of the task indices, but I really didn't want to bore you with that. And although probably it would have been like good supporting evidence, but there's plenty of material available online. So we have a methodological annex to our report, so you can just have a look if you're interested to see what variable exactly we use for the different indices and all the robustness checks that we did to construct them. Now, in order to assess the validity of our framework, which basically consists then in practice in the creation of a database of these standardized task scores at the job level, and by job we mean a combination of ISCO and NAS at the 2-digit level. So what we did, we just had a first look at the results to see whether they match expectations, and broadly speaking, they do. So for instance, I mean, you have it's a bit tricky to read for me as well, but you have office and building cleaners, which is the dark dashed line with a very high score for the physical task, and of course much lower for all the intellectual domains, but then it's picking up again for the social, especially the serving, and then instead is very low for the ICT tools, so this is all look good. And then instead for the public administration clerks, which is the dark line, you have very little physical task content, extremely high instead for the intellectual, especially the literacy and the business literacy more specifically. Then it's a little bit, well, it's quite high in the problem solving as well. And then very high in the ICT tools. So broadly speaking, if it fits expectations, and I think the nice thing is that you can have potentially for each job in the economy, provided data availability, a nice profile of what people do in a very detailed way. And the nice thing is that, for instance, this very simple graph highlights also some interesting patterns. For instance, I mean, we know that broadly speaking, physical and intellectual tasks, they negatively correlate, but you do have occupations, jobs, for instance, the building trade workers, in which you have both a high level of physical tasks, but at the same time, you also have some business technical literacy that it's technical numeracy that it's higher and it's required for the job. Now, another thing that we did with some of the indices of our task framework was to explore how the task content changes over time, and to what extent this change is due to compositional changes, shift between occupations, or to changes within the occupation itself. Again, that's something that Enrique mentioned earlier in the morning. We carried out this analysis to start with the routine index, but we are currently expanding it to all the indices of the framework. And for the routine index, what we found is that there are some opposite trends. While routine jobs are decreasing, there's been compositionally a decline in jobs that have a high routine content, both in terms of repetitiveness and standardization. On the other hand, there is an increase in the reported change at the workers' level of how repetitive and how standardized is their work. So while compositionally in the economy there's this decline, within the remaining jobs in the economy there is actually an increase, and one can speculate to what extent this is due to computerization itself, which may facilitate and require even further standardization of work, or even due to different quality management and the inclusion of benchmarking systems, so more of an institutional rather than technological explanation. And the interesting thing is that this increase of repetitiveness and standardization, especially within certain jobs, it's found especially for some high-skilled occupations, managerial and professional, for which you wouldn't expect this to happen. But I'm sure that we can all find examples of standardization creeping into our daily life, with filling in more forms and complying with some certain numerical or performance targets. Now, we also did, as I was mentioning at the beginning, we did an exercise together with CEDEFOP, which basically combines at the job level our task indices with their employment projections in order to gain some insight on how the task structure could be in the future from now up to 2030. Of course, this is a very simple exercise that has plenty of methodological limitation because all the changes, there's compositional and not in the task indices itself. But what we find is that there's going to be a further decline in occupations that are physically task intense, both in terms of strength and dexterity. There's going to be instead an increase in jobs requiring business literacy, in terms of intellectual tasks, which all increase, but especially business literacy. And then in terms of social, there's going to be especially an increase in the serving, attending, in task-intensive jobs. A further decline in non-ICT machines is predicted, and instead an increase in ICT skills. Now, we had a look at how these projections, how this development are reflected at different job wage quintiles. So we just create different, we did a standard exercise of ranking jobs according to their median wage and then grouping them in quintile. And what we see is that for low wage jobs in the first quintile, the distribution, the projection in terms of task structure is basically the opposite. Thank you. And it kind of mirrors in reverse the one that is presenting instead for the aggregate economy. So an increase in physical tasks, a decline in the intellectual one, and an increase in the repetitiveness. But the increase in the repetitiveness, the decrease in the repetitiveness is actually all accounted for by the third job wage quintile, so middle paid workers, for which instead there is an increase in some of the intellectual and social tasks. And to conclude instead, for the very top quintile, the fifth wage quintile, we find a decline in physical tasks, an increase in intellectual, especially the numeracy, but also the literacy tasks, a decrease in the teaching, with again, it's all driven by compositional changes, and we were a little bit surprised by this result, so we asked CEDEFOP some further details on their projections, and they do find that there's going to be up to 2030 a projected decline in the teaching occupations. So basically, this is all driven by that. How many? Okay, well, I'm just going to wrap up. I mentioned at the beginning that that we also used this framework for some more qualitative studies, and we took a focus specifically on some manufacturing occupations, for instance, car assemblers, which we know they've been severely affected by digitalization, both in terms of manufacturing processes with the new smart factories, use of sensors and algorithms, but also in terms of customer relationships, for instance, with new cars now highly digitized, which allow interaction with users through specialized applications. And for instance, for this type of category that it's usually considered a manual semi-skilled job, predominantly physical, we have seen a change towards taking on more intellectual tasks, both in terms of reading technical documentation and dealing with numerical information, which it could be to some extent related to the introduction of digital equipment that these people have to work with. But also at the same time, the increase of use of quality control standards could be related to this kind of upgrading in terms of using of benchmarking documentation, but also monitoring performance indicators and so on. So again, we think that this shift towards more intellectual tasks could be both technology driven, but also to some extent work organization. So in a nutshell, we do think the task are the fundamental unit of analysis, and we're going to keep updating our task framework, which now is 2016 version, and we know it has some limitations, so we're working on it. So we're very happy to collect any feedback. As I said, it is going to be used as a basis for the LFS ad hoc module in 2022. So we're really looking forward to the data, because that's the main problem that we have. Conceptually, we have some detailed task indices, but then it's another story to map it at the empirical level and to do some meaningful analysis. Thank you.
So many thanks, Martina, and I think that indeed the set of reflections and of methodological proposals and even application is very worth for the discussion and for us in particular, because as I said, what we are trying to do is to expand the set of dimension and indicators to be considered, but having that in a solid quantitative way, and so comparable even with respect to others. I will leave comments to the end, and I think that the Armanda Cetrullo's presentation from Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies a perfect follow-up of what you were starting discussing about, because Armanda will present something about looking beyond tasks and routine and the role of organization and knowledge concerning some of the dynamics that we spoke about this morning and this afternoon. Armanda.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the INAPP Institute, the President, the General Director for hosting this event, and most of all Dario Guarascio for organizing it, and also for supporting me in this intellectually and also emotionally, let's say, in this research project. Thanks. The title, sorry for my voice, I will do my best, but I'm not at my best physical condition. So the title has slightly changed from the one that you have in the paper, in the event, because we decided to stress more the attention on the anatomy of the Italian occupational structure, that is the aim of our study, and on the role, as Dario was saying, of organization, knowledge, and power beyond routine bias technological change. This work is an ongoing project that we are doing thanks to the research agreement that there is between the INAPP Institute and the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, and again we thanks for this opportunity to create a network between university and this kind of institution. And it's an ongoing project that I'm doing with Dario and Maria Enrica Virgilito, that is assistant professor at University of Milano La Cattolica. Okay, so first of all, the aim of this ongoing work is really ongoing, so I will present more some intuitions and some very preliminary considerations. The idea of this work, as I said, is to study the anatomy of the Italian occupational structure, looking exactly at occupational groups that were cited many times during this morning. This will be done actually using the ICT, that is the Indagine Campionaria delle Professioni, that as many, Dario especially said before, is a very rich database that we can use merging information from Istat, rilevazione delle forze lavoro, and so we have a very rich and highly detailed amount of data, both in terms of quantitative information but also qualitative information. Before starting, a very brief observation about the theoretical background in which we are moving in our discussion. Today, Professor Vivarelli already stressed how the discussion on technological change and labor has been treated going back to the classical economist. I just want to add that we move exactly inside the dichotomy between the neoclassical approach that see technological change change as an exogenous factor. We remember that the first model that introduced technological change was the Solow model, and after Solow himself recognized this residual as a measure of our ignorance. So then there was some, let's say, improvement with endogenous growth theory, but still technological change, as also we saw today, is usually seen as a decline in price of computers, still maintain this exogenous nature. On the other side, our approach looks more at evolutionary perspective, according to which technological change is actually embedded in the economic system, in the economic dynamics, and is shaped by institution, by interaction of agents, by capability, and so on. Then what is the theory about wages? Again, we have a dichotomy between a neoclassical approach, according to which wages are the result of marginal productivity of work, and they are defined in the labor market equilibrium. On the other side, we have an evolutionary perspective, according to which wages are instead the result of many factors, depends on the degree of knowledge, on the role in the organization that worker has, on the control that the worker can exert, and in general, from an heterodox point of view, wages are actually reflect power relations among classes, let's say labor and capital classes, and also the strength of institution. Again, we look at this approach in our analysis. So then, okay, there is this current debate about job polarization. I will not go through it because we already discussed a lot. I just say that we see this debate of job polarization a bit more in line with the neoclassical approach, and even if there are empirical findings that we have to take into consideration. So, what about Italy? Okay, let's see. Employment dynamics, as was stressed before by Dario, especially for the period that goes from 2011-2016, seems partly consistent with the routine bias technological change, because we see that the employment growth in the first wage quantile, and also in the, let's say, in the last one, so for the highest level of wage. If we look at the employment growth over RTI quantiles, we see again that the employment is growing more for the less RTI jobs, and is decreasing in the jobs with a higher level of routinization. What about wages? That is the focus of our analysis. First of all, for the period that we are taking into consideration, that is 2011-2016, we have to say that wage do not grow actually. So this is the, you see, low growth. This is the density is around 0. So clearly this comes from a problem that are structural to the Italian economy that were discussed in an event of INAPP last week. So they deal with the slowdown of labor productivity, and also this period is clearly a period after the crisis that has an impact on wages clearly. If we look at the wage growth over RTI quantiles, we see that the relation is less clear than what we saw for employment growth. And for this reason, we decided to look into wages, looking at occupational groups. Sorry, this slide is a bit full of things. Here we have RTI distribution across occupational groups. Dario already presented something similar. We see essentially that for the first group, that is legislator, manager, entrepreneurs, the RTI is very low, whereas it's very high for plant and machine operators and elementary occupation, and also for craft, specialized workers and clerks. For what concerns employment growth and wage growth, here we have the growth, and here we have the different groups, occupational groups. We see that there is a more composite picture that we cannot really relate to the RTI theory, that we have to discuss better. We see here that this is interesting. We see that wages do not grow, but the only group in which there is a very slight growth is for legislators, managers, entrepreneurs. So again, we go deeply into the relation between RTI and wages, looking at occupational groups. Here we have the median wages for the group, and here we have the RTI index. Each group has a different color. What we saw in this picture that actually each groups occupy a specific part of the graph, and so there are structural differences that between among groups that we decided to investigate better, and this is for us is a nice view of what we want to of the heterogeneity and of the difference that we want to study. So our research question is actually this: which are the important factors that we have to study in order to that we have to see in order to study the impact of technological change and the mediating role of all the elements that were cited today, like skill, knowledge, and organization, in order to see how wages are distributed and how work how work change. First of all, what we mean for work. So what is our object of analysis? Again, we use the indagine campionaria delle professioni. Just want to tell you that thanks to this indagine campionaria delle professioni, we can really go deeply into the content of the work, because we can move from 1-digit to 5-digit level of disaggregation that is very closely to the job that people do. And then we can match this information with the productive process and sequence of tasks that are in each profession, thanks to Atlante Lavoro that was cited yesterday by the president. Then we can look at the prevalent economic sector for each occupation. We can look at the composition of the workforce in terms of education, gender, contracts, even geographical origin, but is more geographical position, location, because the geography is related to the economic profession. And we can have also a very comprehensive qualitative analysis on the type of innovation, for instance, that is done, that we will investigate later on in our study. So for us, this is a very good opportunity that also lead us to some puzzle. For instance, what we see here, we see the highest and the lowest wage job in our database. Interestingly, they have almost the same RTI. You see that is 21 and 22, but they really represent different occupation. The lowest wage job is children surveillance personnel and similar occupation. The median wage is 590, almost 600 euro. Interesting, this is an example of highly segregated job, because we have the 94% of workers are women. So this is another example of the kind of analysis that we can do with ICP. We can also see the segregation, the distribution of segregation jobs. This is a job in which there is a low amount of tertiary education worker, and where there is a good, we can say, amount of indeterminate full-time contract, that is 61%. On the other side, we have the highest paid job, that is members of government bodies, so legislators. Okay, this is the medium wage. Here we see that the woman, the number of women is much lower, is 34% of women, but the tertiary level of education is higher, 80% has tertiary education, and so on. So this is just an example of the kind of information that we can extract. So about technological change, I already explained what is our point of reference. So the evolution theory. In this case, we look to a specific type of technological, specific concept, that is innovation. Thanks to the question that Dario was referring today, there is this question where to each worker is asked, have external factors occurred in the last 3 years? Interesting, you can have a lot of information on technological innovation, law innovation, product innovation, work organization innovation, and material innovation. And this is the distribution across the occupational groups. So you see here we have the occupational groups, here we have the intensity of each innovation. This box graph is useful because we can see both the differences across the groups. You see that they come, you can see them easily, but also we can see the dispersion inside each group, because we know this is the average, this is the 25 percentile, this is the 75 percentile, so we can see how much is the dispersion for each type of innovation. innovation. We see that the more intense, the more frequent innovation is clearly the innovation in laws, then come innovation in the organization and innovation in technologies. We see that, for instance, clerks and technicians and associated professors and also intellectual and scientific workers are the one with the highest average of technology of innovation, whereas the ending group, that is the plant and machine operators and especially the elementary occupation, display a very low level of intensity for all the innovation. In our work, in our ongoing work, we look more deeply at technological innovation, organizational innovation, because we consider them functional to our analysis. And here we have just another representation of the dispersion, also with the outside values, outliers. See, okay, so essentially, how can we account for all this heterogeneity, and how can we map this heterogeneity in terms of wage differential and wage differences across groups? We decided to look at three concepts that are digital skills, work organization, knowledge, and learning. We know that there are other factors that impact on wages, like education, gender, economic factor, social factor, and international market, but here we will deal only on these. First of all, digital skills. Digital skills, thanks to the information in the ICP, we can have information on the knowledge, level of knowledge of ICT, use of email, use of personal computer for each occupation. We see that all these variables are positively correlated both with the median wages, then that with technological and organizational innovation. So this is, let's say, consistent with the routine bias technological change theory. But let's look at the distribution of these skills among the groups. We see that clearly there is the digital skills are more present in the first four groups. But just to go back to the discussion of Marcolin about skills, interesting enough, we see that the level of ICT complex knowledge is very low, even in the occupations where we are expecting to have a high level of intensity. So, but this is not the level of skills that people have, this is the level of skills that are required for making the job. So there is all the discussion about the use of skills, how to activate the skills that maybe are there. Then we look at work organization that has been cited during this day. Essentially, we think that these are all dimensions that we have to take into account if we want to say relation with wages and technological change, and we define our work organization indicator looking at the type of work, the autonomy, the social organization structures, that is teamwork, interaction, cooperation, and the dimension of control. We will focus on the dimensional control that can be split in dimension control of the workers or control of the process. This why this? Because we think that control, and in particular control of the workers, can be seen as a proxy, a dimension of power. If we intend for power, what Dosi and Marengo defined as the ability of the ruler to determine the set of action, the possibility to veto the decision that the other people has to take, or to influence and command the choice that the ruled will take. So for us, control of worker is exactly a dimension of power that we want to investigate. So this is again a correlation matrix where we see that all the dimensions of power are positively correlated with the median wages and technological and organizational innovation. In particular, leadership, guiding and motivating others, monitoring other people, whereas, for instance, people that have a responsibility on the people health is positively correlated, but less than people that control the output of other workers. About the distribution, again, we see that clearly leadership is very intense for legislator, manager, intellectual workers, and so on, and it became much lower in the elementary occupation. So this also give us additional information on how occupations are organized. We go from 90 level of intensity to 20 level of intensity, 20 over 100 clearly. Then we see at the control of the process, for instance, we can see the amount of repetitiveness that was cited before, the degree of automatization, the operational analysis. Here the correlation are different because clearly people that have a control of the process seem to be positively correlated with median wages and organizational innovation, whereas people that don't have a control because they do very repetitive movement, their process is highly automatized, are negatively correlated with median wages. And these are clearly variables that are more related with RTI. This is the distribution of control of the process across occupation. Then we look at knowledge and learning. I cannot go into it, but essentially also knowledge and learning, we see that the distribution is different because if the first group have to update frequently, again, plant and elementary occupation don't have to update, and so on. So knowledge again shows us this heterogeneity across occupation. So these are our preliminary consideration that all these factors that we picked are important to take into account because there is a strong heterogeneity across the occupational group. In the future, we will proceed with a factorial analysis to see what comes out. But then we just decided to present a very, very preliminary regression model that just take into account these variables and that is simply an OLS. We are not considering all, but it's just to see how this variable behave. And what we see is that, okay, here log wage is our dependent variable. If we plug only RTI, it is negative and significantly different from 0. Then we introduce all control for education, gender, age, and type of contracts. And we see that they are all significant with the expected sign. For instance, we see that the coefficient for young worker is negative. The coefficient for indeterminate contract is positive. We did also for temporary contract and it was negative. We see that woman, again, there is a high negative coefficient that it's saying, tell us about a gender gap. Okay, and finally we put, yes, I'm finishing. We plug also the new variable that we took from the indicator, that is the digital skill, that is positively significant, confirming Marcolin, yes, analysis. We also see that knowledge and learning indicator, the innovative ideas yes, here is positively significant. And then we introduce the control variable. Interesting, when introduced the control variable, the RTI indicator is still significant, but it loses its negative sign. So this is something clearly we have to investigate, but maybe with the control variable on the control dimension, we get further information that are necessary to look at this kind of phenomenon. So this it is the novelty or consideration. And finally, we think it's very important to look at organization in the spirit of what Braverman in Labor and Monopoly Capital already underlined. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Armanda. The role of productivity has been evoked as a clear and fundamental channel. We were in Italy and we remain in Italy with the presentation of Emanuela Ciampanna from Bank of Italy, but this is a joint work with Fabrizio Colonna. I read the presentation. I've been impressed by the amount of work and the quality of work, both on the theoretical and also on the empirical side, because the data that you are using are very impressive. So, Emanuela, please.
Thank you very much, Dario. You already said that this paper is joint work with Fabrizio Colonna, who is a colleague of mine working at the Bank of Italy Research Department. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for still being here, resisting. The title of the paper is Broadband Adoption, Productivity Dynamics, and Labor Demand. Is there a skill bias in Italy? The question that we address in this work is very simple, and is how does broadband, namely high-speed internet, affect firms' productivity? Namely, we look at labor productivity of skilled and unskilled workers, and total factor productivity. So we also look at the efficiency of the firm. First of all, broadband is a very special technology, and is also probably the most general technology that we can think about when we think of digitization and digital technological process, because this is the enabling technology. Without a broadband network, we cannot have the digital revolution itself. We take the definition of the European Commission in this paper. So we consider high-speed broadband, every connection that is above 2 megabits per second. This was first introduced in Italy by Telecom Italia in 1999. That is the official date of birth of broadband. And the whole territory of our country was rapidly covered, also thanks to the European Digital Agenda 2020. So what we look at is, we look at internet speed, and this is the original contribution of this paper, because even those papers that had investigated broadband did it looking at the extensive margin, that is having or not having broadband, and what is the impact of having broadband on different economic outcomes. This is the first contribution, at the best of our knowledge, that investigates the role of different broadband capacity, different broadband speeds on economic outcomes. So depending on many technical characteristics, internet speed varies significantly across location, even within the same municipality, due to these technical characteristics. And we exploit speed spatial heterogeneity in this paper to identify impact of different internet speed on firms' productivity. We do so by using microdata to estimate a nested CES production function that allows us to take into account heterogeneous labor in terms of skills. And we account for substitutability and complementarity between skilled and unskilled labor in this framework. What are our results in a nutshell? We find that high-speed internet firms immediately register higher productivity of skilled workers, higher share of skilled labor, while in the long run, so with some delay, we also have evidence of higher levels of total factor productivity, so they increase their efficiency in production, and larger average firm size. The outline of the presentation, I will go briefly through the reference literature. I will present our data and identification strategy, some stylized fact on labor demand, then the empirical model on firms' performance, and then the results, and I will conclude. This paper is related to three main streams of the literature. The general literature, looking at the general effects of ICT on labor market outcomes. Then the specific literature, the effect of broadband internet on economic performance and labor market outcomes, with the seminal paper of Chernik, 2011, up to Ackerman, QJ 2015, that is probably the paper that is most related to ours, even if Ackerman looks at the extensive margin. They look at the presence or absence of broadband, while we look at the differences in speed. Regarding our empirical strategy, we will see that we use as our IV the distance of each firm, each facility from the local telephone exchange, from the closest local telephone exchange, so basically the length of the access network. And this is similar to what some other papers had done, particularly in the political economy literature or Billary in the fertility literature. Our data, this is a very new and unique data set that puts together many sources of data. First one is an INVIN data set. Probably somebody of you already know that, but this is a survey on firms in the service and in the manufacturing sector, firms above 20 employees, that is conducted yearly by the Bank of Italy. We use data from 1995 to 2017. Then we merge it with balance sheet information on limited companies sourced from Cerbed. And then we use workforce information that are administrative data sourced from INPS. And then there is this unique data set that is provided us by Telecom Italia, that provides us with the top speed available for every firm in our sample at address point. So for every firm, we give basically what we did. We gave Telecom Italia our sample with our firms, and they provided us with the precise speed that each firm in our sample could have given the distance from their from the closest local telephone exchange. Then there is another data set, but that's the Easter egg, and I will present you the last data set only when I will talk about the instrumental variable. So this picture illustrates in a very simple way how the broadband network works. There is the big internet that is linked through optical fiber to the local telephone exchange, that is the central box. And then there is, and then from the local telephone exchange, other cables that in ADSL technologies are copper-based, but nowadays, since basically 2014 in Italy, 2013 can be mixed optical fiber and copper or totally in fiber. Given that we start our analysis from 1995, we focus our attention on copper technology, copper-based technology. Why is this important? Because copper has a technical property that the signal decays with distance. And we are using exactly this property to identify our model. So basically, we are going to talk of the effect of different speeds on our outcome variables, and speed depends on two elements. First, all these boxes, all these phone local exchanges can be endowed with different technologies. So it can be, even in the family of the ADSL, it can be ADSL to VDSL technologies that can vary from 2 to even 50 megabits per second. So even the technology matters. And the other important variable that matters a lot is the distance from facility. While the first one is endogenous, the second one is totally exogenous. And now I'm going to try, this is basically the relationship between distance and speed. As you can see, very close firms are going to have higher speed than very distant firms. Up to narrow bound. These are the speeds in our sample firms as of 2000. As you can see, only 5% of our firms are basically in narrow broadband, but there is some heterogeneity in speed. So these two maps. In the first map, we can see the dissemination, the distribution of local telephone exchanges. This is the universe of Telecom Italia. And the other map represents the INVIN sample of our firms. So as you can see, the extensive margin is not so important, so we look at the intensive margin. But does speed really matter for firm performance? So this is the first question. Let's take, for instance, an example of a 50 employees firm in hospitality business as of 2018. As you can see, if you just want to use the web and send your emails, you just would need about 15 megabits per second. But to do some more advanced things and to count on more advanced technologies, you can need even up to 50 or 60 megabits per second. So speed really matters if you want to progress in your technological frontier. Same thing for a manufacturing firm, both in terms of product innovation and in terms of process innovation. For instance, to do Internet of Things that is on every newspaper today, you need at least 50 megabits per second. So this is our baseline equation. We regress a certain outcome variable on internet speed and some controls. What are the potential bias that can affect our relationship? So it's reverse causality. So it can be that larger and more productive firms have higher broadband speed. And so what we do, we look at for an exogenous supply shifter, that is our IV, and it is the distance of facility from the closest local exchange. And this is our Easter egg. This is a unique data set of geolocal position of the universe of all the exchanges provided by Telecom Italia. And this allows us to compute the minimum distance from our facility to the closest exchange. Then we can have omitted variable bias. Firms having higher speed broadband could enjoy larger network economies. So we control for the average local speed, and we also construct a density variable that is the number of local telephone exchanges in a radius of 3 kilometers. Our exclusion restriction is that the distance from the local telephone exchange influences firms' outcome only through broadband capacity. So how do I convince you that this exclusion restriction is valid? Okay, I will try. Local exchange in Italy date back to 1945 as part of the telephone network in the post-war period when broadband was not born, and they responded to a logic of universal service for the telephone network that didn't suffer this distance speed trade-off. Their number and location remains fixed over time, more importantly. And anyway, to be more convincing, we exclude all those firms that were born after 1999, so after the broadband was born. So this is our IV regression, where speed IV is the first stage fit. And our assumption is that this beta becomes significantly different from 0 after 1999. Okay, the first stage I can skip. It provides you again the negative relationship between distance and speed. So these are our labor outcomes: average size, employment skill shares. How do we proxy skill shares? Blue collars, white collars, and managers is the best we can do with administrative data. How bad or how good is this approximation? We use the labor force survey to answer this question. So we, in this graph, we plot qualifications and with ISCO codes that are, as you know, that are inversely ranked. So from 0 to 2, high skilled, from 3 to 4, middle skilled, and from 6 to 8, low skilled. And I think this qualification procedure does quite a good job, because at least at the 95% statistical level. These are just descriptives, and this gives us the idea of the parallel trends. As you can see, for employment, the effect is visible just in the last part of our period, but for skills, it's quite evident since the beginning, since introduction, that the red line is firms that are whose distance from the telephone exchange is less than 2 kilometers. So these are high-speed firms with higher broadband capacity, while the blue line are those firms that can count on lower broadband capacity. So as you can see, there is a decrease in low-skilled and an increase in high-skilled jobs. This instead is a real regression, so it controls for all, it has all the controls also at firm fixed effect. And as you can see, there is a statistically significant and positive impact on employment in the last part of the period, while for the share of high-skilled job, this is significant since introduction. Then, as the last part of the paper, we present a model of a Cobb-Douglas production function that is where labor is a composite input, and theta is the relative skilled labor productivity, which in a Cobb-Douglas would be the share of skilled labor. And sigma is the elasticity of substitution between skilled and unskilled labor. we proceed with the two-step estimation. We estimate sigma and theta, and then estimate the share of capital and labor and the TFP using the standard methodologies of Woodridge and Levinson and Pakes. In the first step, given wages of skilled and unskilled labor and rearranging the first order condition with respect to the two types of labor, we find, and putting it in log, we find this equation in labor, wages, and theta, that is basically the labor productivity of high-skilled job. We estimate sigma by instrumenting the wage share with the minimum level contractual wages. And we estimate theta as a residual. Then we plug sigma and theta in our production function and find the TFP. And sigma. So I will just go to the final results. We retrieve consistently with what we had found in our previous estimation, that since adoption, since introduction, firms having higher broadband capacity, so higher speed broadband, have a higher labor productivity of skilled labor. This is in difference, so is skilled labor after 2000 with respect to the control group that is unskilled labor, that is low speed firms before. And the effect on TFP is retrieved, but with some lag. And we interpret this result like first they adjust for labor. First firms adjust for labor composition, and they basically they adjust by hiring more high-skilled labor. And afterwards, you can also see gains in efficiency at the firm level. If we compare our estimates with the Cobb-Douglas case, always applied in our sample firms, we retrieve similar results with respect to Ackerman and co-authors in the QJE 2015. In both the specifications, you can see positive and statistically significant results for high-skilled labor productivity. But in the Cobb-Douglas case, as in the Ackerman paper, they're not able to retrieve any results on the TFP. And we suspect that this is because they fix the elasticity of substitution between skilled and unskilled labor at 1, as in the Cobb-Douglas case, while we estimate it, and and the level for us is, you see, very close to 0.6. So that is also very consistent with the labor literature. So just to conclude, we look at the effects of different broadband capacity among Italian firms on labor demand and firm performance by using a novel and very rich data set. We use a technology-based IV, that is the minimum distance from the local telephone exchange. What do we find? That firms that have higher speed broadband also see a higher share of skilled labor, higher labor productivity of skilled workers, and higher efficiency in terms of total factor productivity. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much, Emanuela, for this interesting presentation. And so the last, but for sure not the least presenter, because we have now Eckhard Herz from the International Labour Organization, and partly we will move back to something that we discussed this morning, that is artificial intelligence, and maybe something that we do not discuss, I mean the relation between humans and these new technologies that are threatening us, but maybe we are overemphasizing this threat. So,
thank you.
Please, Eckhard.
Thank you. Yeah, first of all, let me thank you, the organizers, INAPP, and very much Stefano, actually, to have me here today. It was a very short recently decided only addition to the program, so I'm really grateful for that, and also to Dario, obviously, to make this happen. Just to give you a bit of a context, so the ILO, as you might know, is celebrating its 100th birthday next year, and in that context, we have started looking more broadly into issues of future of work. There's a global commission that was set up 2 years ago, looking into all different types of trends that is shaping the future of work, not only in OECD and advanced economies, but also in emerging and developing countries. And part of that work, that exercise that we did was looking specifically into technological changes. And so this is basically the few remarks that I will make to this evening are based on this type of research, summarizing actually several papers without necessarily going into all of the details that are behind that. Let me start by making one remark, and that comes back a bit to the discussion that we had this morning about the fear of robots. And Ulrich had a very nice quote from German newspapers on this. I think that the real question really comes from the fact that people are confused between comparative versus absolute advantages of these technologies. And so most economies, when they think about technological progress, they think about comparative advantages, whereas most people in the press or in the public opinion think about absolute advantage. And so I want to kind of dismiss this fear right from the beginning, saying that the absolute advantage we shouldn't be too afraid of, because of one simple thing, which is the energy efficiency of these new technologies, at least the digital technology, is extremely poor. So I've quoted here this person is a CEO of an artificial intelligence company in Germany, founded in 1995, and he recently gave an interview saying that if you look at large neural networks, or these kind of complicated statistical tools that you have and that run all these artificial intelligence routines, the most complicated tools that we currently have a or actually he says a million nodes. So you kind of think about these nodes as the neurons that you have in your brain. And they actually need a full nuclear power plant to run. So if you think about your own brain, that has 8.5 billion neurons and runs on a slice of bread. So the energy efficiency of these tools is extremely poor. And in this sense, we shouldn't be at all afraid that any kind of robot will take, or any kind of machine will take up our tasks in the near future. I think what we really should be afraid of more is something else. So here I've depicted, and again, this is basically summarizing some of the discussion we had during the day in terms of the falling cost of capital related to these improvements, and massive improvements in digital technologies. I always give this example. I mean, my kids make fun of me. I still have this iPhone 7, which is totally outdated now. But if you think about this iPhone 7 here, the production cost when it came out was $220. If you wanted to use just the same type of memory that is in an iPhone 7 with the technology in 1984, it would have cost you $1.2 million US. So that's a massive drop in computing cost. And at the same time, as you see here on this chart, this is basically an average for 12 OECD countries. The job destruction rates have fallen at the same time. So I mean, apparently there was not much in terms of job destruction going on, despite the fact that this technology has become so cheap. What did increase, and that's the more relevant question, is the inequality, so this dashed purple line that runs through the chart. So obviously we can't argue that has something to do with artificial intelligence, because at that time we didn't really have much artificial intelligence. But all kind of digital technologies, automation, robotization, etc., were present at the time. And so the question is, so what are the different aspects? And I think that where the specificities of artificial intelligence comes in, and where the rest of my remarks will be triggered about. And I've tried to kind of distinguish a bit what is specific about artificial intelligence, how and what are these drivers behind this rising inequality. Yeah? So the first one is the rising demand for skills. We have talked about this, that a lot of these skills that are needed are actually not yet present. If you think about Facebook, for instance, currently investing in a Facebook university in Silicon Valley just to have enough software engineers. It's not that we don't have enough engineers, we don't have enough software engineers to run this. But then again, the overall demand for this type of skills might be actually quite limited. I give always this example. If you think about Google has 60,000 employees, has the same type of stock market valuation as Walmart. Walmart has 2.2 million employees, so somehow the demand for labor from these new tech companies cannot be that high. It's actually a small portion of the overall employment. So there might be rising demand for skills, and it's mostly biased towards high and medium high income countries, whereas in most, let's say, Latin American and sub-Saharan African countries, actually there is not so much of a skill bias. But so there is if you want, a geographical mismatch between where the skill is demanded and where the capacity, the human brain, potential brain power is. Then the other point is just a continuation of some trends that we have seen in the past, and where again the distributional aspect that was mentioned already during the day might actually play against labor at least. So this is here. I mean, I just depicted it from our global wage trends. That's just as a short intersection here that we have yesterday published. The latest issue of the Global Wage Report. So for those who are interested, you can look at our website. But this is basically just to show you that there was this decline in the labor income share. So the total amount of wages are being paid in an economy, and so we see that this has been falling over the last 20 years and will continue according to the projection, and most likely because of these digital technologies. Again, this is not necessarily specific to to artificial intelligence, but it just adds up to what we have been seeing in the past. More closely, what is really specific to artificial intelligence is a spatial inequality effect, or let's say a business demographic inequality effect, in a sense that you have these high-tech companies, or some companies that use this, and we have just seen it in the case of Italy, some companies using these technologies, moving really quickly ahead in the productivity sphere, and all the others cannot, for whatever reason. It might be because of distance to the next telecom node, it might be because they don't find the right works, etc. They're not in the right location, but there is a business demographics effect, and it plays out in productivity. And here I have shown you the example for compensation. So this is actually data from our colleagues from the OECD, where you see the frontier firms, people moving ahead, and actually everybody in these people in these companies moves ahead. Not only the tech engineer, but also the cleaning personnel. So everybody is moving ahead in these companies. If you live in Silicon Valley and work for them, you're actually better off than if you live, for instance, in Little Rock in Arkansas also. So this is kind of a spatial inequality effect, and we see some of the political fallout from this already. Even more concretely to artificial intelligence is the fact that these routines, and you see that if you buy on Amazon, or if you buy your train ticket or your flight ticket with EasyJet, etc., you see that there is a granular discrimination, because these tools, what they're really supposed to do, they identify what is your purchasing power, and in the case of labor markets, for instance, in HR, in the human resource world, what is your reservation rate? So these kind of routines try to exactly target how much rent can I extract from you, and how little wage I can pay you just for you to accept a wage offer. So at some point it enhances matching efficiency. If you go to LinkedIn, etc., so it's supposed to kind of improve the matching process. So that's a great thing. So McKinsey has done some study. They claim that global GDP might actually increase by 2 or 3% just because of the increasing efficiency on markets. But at the same time, it increases the price discrimination. So the overall loss of efficiency is limited, but the gain that you get is increasingly going to companies. Hence, again, this increasing share of money or share of profits. And then I think once more specifically, especially when you look at the world of labor, it has this tendency to create or to perpetuate historical biases. There was a recent example that you also have kind of probably seen in the press, that Amazon tried to use these routines to hire people, and they realized that, well, they actually do repeat the same mistakes that a human hiring manager would make. They say that we overhire men and we underhire women, and that might be for any number of categories that you can think about. But the point is that you actually basically repeat the same mistake as you did in the past. So we don't want that, and for the moment at least, we have not found a way of how we can train these artificial intelligence tools in such a way that they don't produce or repeat the same mistakes. Now, one specific aspect, and that I'm saying this especially because coming from the ILO, we also want to look at, obviously, at the world of labor outside OECD countries. And so the question for us was, first of all, we don't have AI is a really recent phenomenon. We don't really can test these effects. So the only thing we can do is we can basically use the approaches that have been applied for OECD countries on robotization and try to apply them to countries outside OECD countries. So that's what we did here. And what is really puzzling is, so this is basically from a paper. You can see all the nitty-gritty details of the technical aspects. What I wanted to focus on is on just this first line is here on the impact of robots on the employment level in logs. And so this is the equation underneath is really standard. People have done it. I mean, this is basically based on some literature review that we've done, and we just kind of repeat the same exercise, but we increase the amount of countries that we include. And what you see is the coefficient at the first line. If you look at just the difference between developed and developing countries, is enormously different. So actually the impact of robotization on developing countries is much larger and much more negative than on developed economies. And my interpretation of this, and this is certainly open to discussion, is that as much as technology is endogenous to advanced economies, it is exogenous to developing countries, in the sense that most developing countries are part of a supply chain and they have to use these technologies, which means that these technologies are inefficient from their price, wage, interest rate, relative prices. So they actually use technologies that are inefficient because they have more labor that they could use and they are not used. You see this kind of effects in any kind of supply chain, but here particularly in terms of robotization, it comes out clearly. And I think that is from our perspective the biggest worry in terms of what these technology potentially might do further damage to countries that already have weak labor markets to begin with. Now. Looking at some of the policy implication, I think one of the aspects that has been already mentioned was the kind of concentration that STEM is not the only skill that is being increasing in demand for this type of technologies. But I always say that if you really want to be complementary to these skills, you actually need the more social and emotional skills for this. And the example I always give is when you look at a doctor. A doctor can now increasingly, at least that's what's being claimed, increasingly rely on these technologies to kind of support him or her in the analysis and diagnosis of a patient's problem. But that means that you actually have to spend more time with the patient, which is a great thing. I mean, this is actually this emotional tie that the doctor has with the patient is extremely important for the recovery process. But you need to have that. So you can't just sit in your cabinet anymore and just say, okay, well, I want to concentrate on diagnosing the patient's problem and don't have any interaction with it. So you really have to have this social skills, which is to say that in a sense we need to find a way of getting this type or emphasizing this more in our education, and to kind of make sure that these things are being developed as people progress professionally. Yeah? I think more to the point also to discussion this morning was the redistribution aspect. As I mentioned, a lot of this AI and this new technology, digital tools will kind of not so much shed labor, but will kind of shift profits or shift money from workers to profits. And so there are different ways of thinking about what to do with it. So some is this obviously digital taxation. As you know, the United Kingdom has started thinking about, they will implement a consumption tax on this. And then colleagues of mine from Germany and others have kind of thought about this digital social security. As you're aware, the universal basic income, etc., is a very large discussion and still unsettled in some respects. And then there are all discussion from the past actually coming back on profit sharing. We need to have more profit sharing. Richard Freeman is one of those who kind of bring this back to the table, and I would agree with this. Obviously, with the caveat that if you don't have good social partners on the table, it's very difficult to do any kind of negotiation. The specific point I would like to make is on the second point, which is this taxing public goods and sovereign wealth funds. So this seems to be very removed, and I mean maybe it's because I'm by training a macroeconomist, so I'm kind of bringing this type of ideas. And I think I always give this example is if the United States had invested in Apple shares at the level of 0.05% in 1999, they would have today, maybe not right now because the Apple share has lost its bit of value, but let's say for 2 weeks ago would have made 1% of GDP. Huh? So there's enormous gain that just on capitalization, valuation effects. And so I think that we have to think about new innovative ways of how to extract the money for public good provision out of these digital companies. And I mean, this is one example. Sovereign wealth funds is not something new, and we can basically think about the digital technologies as as commodities, if you want, that need to be exploited. So the other thing, and we have quickly talked about this already in the morning, is kind of maintaining a level playing field. And it's actually quite complicated to do so. And I want to give you this one example. I don't necessarily want to go into IPR issues, etc., but this data portability that Alan Manning also was talking about in the morning. Yeah? So this is actually quite complicated if you think about the idea being that if you really want to create competition among platforms, you have to be able, as an individual user of these platforms, to move from one platform to the other. I give you one example. I use ResearchGate for my own publication quite a bit. And ResearchGate, okay, you can upload all the stuff, it's great. It also has this nice feature, it gives you some kind of calculations with an algorithm that nobody knows what is behind this, on how good or bad, if you want, your ResearchGate score is. Now, given that the algorithm is not known, if I can obviously extract all the information from ResearchGate and move to another platform if there is one, but the scoring itself is proprietary to ResearchGate, so I can't really take this with me. And so this might be a silly example, but if you think about you generating money for yourself by being on these platforms, it is actually an essential information that you need to be able to take with you to another platform. So this is actually something that hasn't been solved, and to a certain extent, it relies a lot on standardization. So in a way, governments or international agencies need to agree on certain standards that need to be available throughout these platforms, so that you can take your information and generate similar scores on a different platform based on the information that you provide that you can take with you. So that, I think that's an important one. The other one, and people have talked about this as well, is treat data as labor, and that's actually a relatively relevant aspect as well. If you think about health information that you might provide, I mean, I use it for my own running tracking, all these devices. Now, there's a lot of health information. I don't know what these I'm almost done. What these platforms are doing with my information. Especially what I don't know is to what extent they make money out of it. I don't have any control over this, and so I think that would be useful to kind of be able to say, you can use this data for this and these purposes, but at the moment when you really make money, I want to be involved in this because I provide you the data. You are not the one who is generating the data. So, and I think that again, public policy needs to intervene in this. I think that there are several public infrastructure issues around these ideas. I always promote the idea that you need kind of, if you want to use AI tools, you need to have some kind of basic, you need to treat this as a public utility, as much as you treat electricity as a public utility or trains and roads. You need to make the same for AI, so that the companies can actually use a certain basic set of AI tools for themselves at a relatively low cost. It can be through collaboration with universities, etc. One important aspect I want to stress, I mean, among all these things that I mentioned, digital infrastructure was already mentioned. I don't want to go in. I want to mention this international cooperation issue, because I think it's an essential element that people overlook a bit. One of the key issues with artificial intelligence, it's an intangible capital. And intangible capital have this tendency to create economies of scale. That's why we see all this inequality. Now, with large economies of scales, all our typical economic models, they fall apart. All the ideas of maintaining a level playing field, competition, etc., don't work anymore. And so it creates a lot of prisoner dilemmas issues, where actually, as an individual country, you have an incentive to kind of close your borders to other people, to make sure that you grab as the largest share as you can of these technologies. And you see that in the US, and my interpretation of what's happening in the US is exactly that. So try to grab as much as you can. And so international cooperation is key if you want to maintain open borders in this respect, and to benefit everybody from this technology. So this is my conclusion, basically. I said that, so in principle, these AI tools have a large promise large productivity gains, and can really enhance structural transformation, and in a sense that we actually shouldn't be afraid of it, as I said, for some very simple reasons, that these technologies have a limited capacity to really kind of create absolute advantages. But it does transform, this technology do transform capitalism in a way that enforces even, or reinforces the disadvantage of labor with respect to capital on these markets. And so it creates a challenge for sharing wealth for our future. In this sense, I think international organizations as mine are enormously important to kind of ensure that we keep up the dialogue, and that we kind of promote cooperative solutions for sharing this wealth for everybody. Thank you very much.
So thanks, Eckhard. Also, thanks for bringing the discussion again on the policy side. That is what we need, and that is perfect for concluding such 2 days of this kind. But I would like also to thank the second one, who have an heroic task to make in 10 minutes discussing 4 presentations, and so thank Paolo Naticchioni from INPS and on leave from University of Roma Tre, and please, 10 minutes of floor for you.
10 minutes and entertain the audience. Yeah, thank you for remaining here until now. I think it has been a tough day, and I will say a few things in a slow pace, so I hope I will be clear. So first of all, I will focus on the first 2 papers that are some common traits. No? In a sense, they both talk about organizational issues, no? How organization can play a role together with organization. So this morning, Enrique was talking about the elephant in the room, no? And so it's nice as a picture. And so it's interesting. So to me, it's not clear so which is the role of the elephant in a sense. I do not think that, for instance, neoclassical economics, they do not think that there is an organizational dimension that is important. I would think that they would argue that it's just an outcome. In a sense, the driving force is the technology, is the routinization stuff. And then, of course, once you have market signals, no, like the decreasing price in investment, in cost of capital, and so on, these signals push firms to change their organizational structure because it's consistent with this technological framework. And so for this reason, they don't care, in a sense. So here, it's important to me to understand what is the critique to this way of reasoning. In a sense, we are thinking the completely way around, in a sense, that is the organizational change that implies that is the driving force, and so the routinization is just an outcome, a consequence. So if so, it would be a completely different story, and would be not so straightforward to understand. And so if there is no this extreme version, so the completely offset relation, so it's important to understand how they interact, no? In a sense, they are both important, and so I think today we have often talked about them, but not how they are together, why they interact. You know, to me, it's important to understand if one of the two come first, or if there are some interaction. If so, which are the interaction? Which is the model that is important to take into account? And so this is a general. And I think it's very interesting, no, to understand the relation between these two kind of stuff. And then, of course, these has an impact when you run regression, no? Because if you think that one of the two is the driving force and the other one is an outcome, of course, you shouldn't put the other one in the regression because it's an outcome, it's endogenous. If you think they interact, so it's important to understand why, how, for which occupation, which sectors, and so on. Of course, they are significant, no, when you include them in the regression, but it's like not really meaningful. And so, just some specific point on the paper. Like in the Martina paper, I was just wondering whether these index are country specific, and no. So for the moment, they are like at the European level. Okay. And yeah. So I have other questions, but I think we can talk later. So for the second paper, so the same general comments, and then some remarks. For instance, when we want to compare, I think, to the neoclassical model, I think we should go beyond the text micro one assumption that wages is equal to productivity. In a sense, of course, this is true, but then there are thousands of papers that address many issues like imperfect competitions, unions, many other imperfections. So I think if someone wants to criticize the neoclassical model, they have to face the real neoclassical model nowadays that is much more complex, no, in a sense. And so I think it would be interesting, why this advanced model that take into account like unionization, minimum wage, different bargaining power, and so on, why they cannot take account of this kind of relation. For the logarithm part, I would suggest like using also, I think you will do it, so it's probably not necessary to do it in quantile regression, of course, because then you assume that the routinization impact is not homogeneous along the quantile distribution, so you should expect a stronger impact in the middle and so on. So it would be interesting to understand. And also, when you introduce all the organizational control, then of course you have to, they are endogenous, they are outcome or not. If you have a model, you can say something, or otherwise you have some problem. And I think they are not just econometric model, no, they are much more general problems. Then of course you have to face in the empirical part, but I think they are more general. It's not just econometric tricks to solve a problem. So for the other two papers, so for the paper by, I don't remember the name, the Bank of Italy? Emanuela. I really appreciate the paper, it's very interesting, and I would, some comments, of course, it would be interesting to know something about firms with low, with a number of employees lower than 20. In Italy, like 95% of firms have lower than 20 employees. In the paper, you address the issue for top 5%, more or less. It's interesting, of course, because they are probably the most advanced firms. But from a policy point of view, it would be interesting to know something about also a firm that I think is not possible because the wind does not have these kind of firms. Another issue, I was wondering whether there is a threshold in the broadband in speed. In a sense, once you have like 20, 30 megabytes, it's enough, you are fine. If so, maybe you might take into account some nonlinearity, in a sense, this continuous version. I think that most of the firm having 20 or having 100 maybe is the same, and so some nonlinearity. And another issue concerned the fact that you observe firms that have decided to be in some location or to remain there. That still is an endogenous issue. Now, if you are a firm that are a high-tech firm, and in 2002 you see that your speed is very low, you move. And of course, you cannot. I think you cannot take into account this issue in your data. So this, so you observe the survival firms. So those who remain have accepted this kind of low speed, and this might be interesting to also like considering only the firms that were born before '99 is a strong selection in a sense. You do not consider all the startup firms that maybe have been growing in the last years when the broadband became even more important. And I was wondering, because you consider the whole sample from 99 to 2015, but I think at the beginning the broadband was very limited. Maybe in some region the broadband arrived like in 2001. In some, I don't know. I really don't know. But I think that the implementation has been rather slow. Maybe at the beginning only in the big city, and then in other region. And I wonder whether you could exploit this heterogeneity in the time implementation in order to have another identification strategy. So the last paper, it's more a policy paper, so I don't have any technical remark. It's I think most of the correlation that has been shown are interesting. Of course, they are just correlation. We don't know, like the correlation between the cost of computer storage and inequality. Yeah, there is these different trends, but of course we don't know whether there is some causal relation between the two. And I agree with the general punchline of the paper. Of course, we should understand whether there is like some causal relation between the variables, because I think it's what we are interested in, no? Also, for instance, like the cleaner that earn a lot in the Silicon Valley, of course, this is not just a question of that. It's more productive than another cleaner in a depressed area. But if you want to live there, you have to have higher wages. Otherwise, you have no cleaner there. So it's just a cost of living issue. From the policy issue, I agree, of course. I think it's going to be very tough. I would just stress something that you have talked about at the end. So the fact that to have some policy, you should have a policy coordination, a global policy coordination. And I think for the moment we don't observe much in this level. And if you want to do some policy with these high-tech companies, of course, you should cover the globe, otherwise they can escape when they want. And the last question that has not been addressed, of course, who own the robots? No, we know that this is going to be an issue, and from a policy point of view, it's going to be, can we redistribute the returns from robots? Who owns the robot? This is something that is very well debated. Okay, I hope I've been time.
Okay, so thank you, because you stayed in your time and you provided a lot of yeah. Okay, so I don't know if maybe if there are some, we can also collect 1-2 questions so that then they just respond to Paolo, but as I supposed, no one has the strength to do something like that. Okay.
Well, just quickly, I mean, I'm not going to try to attempt to find an explanation for the relationship of technological change and work organization, but I think the intuition from our part, the rationale why we're looking at that in the context of the automation of work debate is more work organization as a mediator of the potential impact of displacement of certain tasks. So as Enrique was mentioning this morning, the intuition would be that the more work is organized in a way that the human intelligence and autonomy is limited, so it's more discrete, centralized and standardized, this can amplify further certain effects on the task content. So that's a little bit the rationale for including it in the picture. But of course, I mean, we fully acknowledge that it's a very complex relationship, so it requires much more investigation. But I think it's good that there are a lot of papers now doing that, so it's an important point. And regarding the task indices, yes, they're measured at the European level, mainly for data availability problems.
Before handing the mic to Armanda, just as a call for, I add something, because this is a crucial point, according to me. I mean, recalling Harry Braverman, the point is that organization and technological change are, in a way, the same thing. And if we bring power and objectives within the picture, so power is asymmetrically distributed, and the process and the technology is under the control of the firm. So at the very end, if the objective is, in a way, spurring efficiency and augmenting the control over knowledge and over process, in a way adapting the organization and innovating the technological process is something that, well, of course, there can be some lag, but I see it, and reading Braverman, this is very clear as a kind of very intertwined thing. So I don't think is correct to look at technology as something within its perimeter that is here and then, okay, there is technological change, so now I think how to adapt my organization. I think that if we make the picture more complex, then we can frame the concept of organizational and technological change together in a rather different way. This is just my take on this.
Yes, adding something to Dario, for what concerns the question on organization, actually, maybe I have a limited view, but I think that the problem is that for neoclassical approach, the organization is an outcome. As Dario was saying, as Braverman underlined, and there is a quote in my presentation, in order to deal with this subject, we have to take from one side the analysis, historical, social, and we can add economic analysis of technology, and on the other side, the social relations. And we cannot forget that technology is implemented in a specific social organization, a specific system that is, in our case, the capitalist system. That's why I totally agree, of course, with Dario that is co-authoring this, but I think that Braveman is really enlightening for saying this. About the simplification of neoclassical talk, it's true, I simplified workers. There is not only the story of marginal productivity, there is much more, also with respect to imperfection, monopsony, labor market, but still I think that there are some main problems with the neoclassical approach for what concerns the assumption of the production function that are hardly believable from an evolutionary point of view. There is a problem in terms of path dependence of the issues that we are studying. There is a problem in terms of really dealing with the heterogeneity of workers that is not only regarding skills and education, and there is a problem in putting inside the analysis the dimension of class power and institutional power that I consider fundamental also from an economic point of view. But thanks also for your suggestion.
Thank you very much for your very interesting comments. I will try to address all of them. The first one, of course, it's it would be very interesting to analyze the outcomes for small firms, for SMEs. Okay, by the way, INVIN is a sample that is not representative in terms of number of firms, but it represents 80% of value added and 75% of employment. So it depends on what is your unity that you want to be representative. Of course, the problem is not only INVIN, but is also that CERVED, for instance, is only for limited companies. So we should completely change our firm data set. But I agree, it would be very interesting for Italy. So thresholds, okay, while speed is never enough, I mean, of course, what you can do with that 1 gigabit per second is still much better in terms of productivity with respect to what you can do with 150. So there are no thresholds, there is no upper bound, let's say. But we observe discontinuities. In fact, all the graphs that I show you are distinguishing between firms that are closer or further than 2 kilometers. That is basically what our data are telling us, that this 2 kilometer threshold is quite important. And then after 5 kilometers, you don't have broadband any longer, so you cannot speak about broadband connection. Regarding the fact that not all the firms immediately get broadband, as you could see from the graph of speeds as of 2000 in our sample, just 5% of firms didn't have broadband at introduction, because as you underlined, these are quite large firms. And also, I didn't mention that we have a question in the INVIN survey where we asked for, that was posted in 2001, where we asked firms whether or not they adopt broadband. That, of course, we didn't use because it's endogenous, but it's a good control to understand if they not only have the possibility of a connection, but they also use it. And basically, 6% of respondents said they didn't adopt. While the last question is, of course, core. And this I see it as the trade-off between selection, how selected is your sample, and how credible is your IV strategy. As a researcher and as an economist, you have to choose a balance along this trade-off. What is more important, to have a very strong IV and to make your exogeneity assumption credible, or to address, and then to run robustness checks in terms of sample selection, and this is basically what we decided to do, or to risk to take firms that were born even after 99, and then of course this exposes you to critiques like, okay, but firms can locate where there is a better connection. We are still working in this paper, so we are running robustness checks. What I can say, this is a balance panel, basically, as you said, these are all firms because they survived up to 2015. We are taking firms that were, first stage, we are taking firms that were born not after 1999, but with entry and exit to control for firms that didn't survive up to 2015. And this doesn't change doesn't seem to change our results. And to take firms that were born afterwards, I mean, we can do that, but it's very endogenous. I mean, you are, in a sense, if you can locate wherever you want, I mean, they're going to tell you that this is, in a sense, this can depend on where there is a better connection. So we can do it, but I think it's quite risky in terms of identification. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you also from my side. I mean, I perfectly agree with you. There's a lot of things that happen over this large period of time other than technological change. And I mean, we talked about this during the day in terms of weakening trade unions, weakening institutions, etc., that might have been driving some of these results. I think my basic point was to say that what we don't see is that this technological change somehow is in any kind of race related to large drops in employment, and I think that's not really particularly contentious. What I was presenting there. The other point I think I would really like to drive home is that given that all these other changes have happened in terms of weakening labor market institutions, we need to really come out with alternative, innovative solutions to these inequality issues. And as I said, I mean, I think that digital taxation might be one issue, universal basic income might be another one, but there are alternative issues, and specifically related to artificial intelligence and digital technologies that we need to address. And global coordination of policy-making institutions is one thing, but I think it needs to go beyond. We can't just repeat and try to say, okay, well, let's bring trade unions back on the table. They are not there, and we don't have a good idea of how to bring them back. Thank you.
Okay. So, Stefano, would you like to? No. Okay, so let me just pick up the opportunity for the survivors who are still here to thank you all again, and to transfer you how happy and glad we are of how these 2 days have gone. And so thank you very much again. And all the presentation papers and a wrap-up of these 2 days will be on the INAPP website in the incoming days. You find working papers, some of those that have been discussed, again, on the INAPP website. And so you can follow us, because things like that will be, I think, happening in the next month from 2019, most probably onwards. But thank you very much on my side. Thank you again to Stefano Sacchi, to the president of INAPP, to the general director Paola Nicastro, who is not here now, but in her office, and thank for making all this possible. Thank you for the panelists. Thank you to Paolo for discussing, and see you at the next event. Okay, thank you.